The energy transition, what is it? It's a hot topic in hot words that the government is using and energy experts. I bring in an international panel today to discuss this and much more on this episode of The Crude Truth.
In 1901, at Spindletop Hill near Beaumont, the future of Texas changed dramatically as, like a fountain of fortune, thousands of barrels of oil burst from the earth towards the sky. Soon, Detroit would be cranking out Model Ts by the millions, and America was on the move, thanks to the black gold being produced in Texas. Now, more than a century later, the vehicles are different, but nothing else has truly changed. Sure, there may be many other alternative energy sources like wind and solar and electric. But let's be honest, America depends on oil and entrepreneurs, and if the USA is truly going to be independent, it has to know the crude truth.
This episode of The Crude Truth is brought to you by Oil and Gas Workers Association, Sandstone Group, Air Compressor Solutions, Basin Fluids, and the Fuel Pros.
Well, the energy transition, when you think of that word, it means so much these days, and it's got such a big responsibility and what a global impact that word is so big that I couldn't just bring in one individual today to talk about the energy transition, but I had to bring in an international panel of experts to come in today. You may recognize them all. They are the hosts of the Energy Transition Podcast. I'm going to go down the line one by one today, and I'm going to start with Irina Slav. She is an energy, mining, and geopolitical expert hailing from Bulgaria. Irina, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you, Alki. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you for being on. And then next up, hailing from the country of Brazil in South America, I've got Armando Cavanha. Armando, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you, and thanks for having me.
And for those of you that do not know, Armando has published over 100 groups of essays and articles, and also has 5 books out that are all on Amazon talking about different parts of the energy world. Next, I've got hailing from the United Kingdom, Miss Tammy Nemeth. Tammy, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Happy to be here.
Oh, excited to have you here. And Tammy is also an energy expert, and I can't wait to dive into everything that's going on there in the United Kingdom at this point. I'm glad you're doing well. And last but not least, I've got a man that is very much responsible for assisting me and actually getting this Crude Truth episode put together, is David Blackmon. David, how are you?
I'm just fantastic. It's a beautiful day in Texas.
Well, I'm excited to have you on. And for those of you that do not know, David is a Forbes contributing author, He's also another energy expert, hails from the state/country of Texas, if you couldn't tell. And he's also not only a good friend of mine, but a fellow podcast host with me on the Three Podcasters Walk Into a Bar. But today we're talking about the Energy Transition Podcast. Guys, thank y'all. After all those introductions, welcome to the Crude Truth. And as I can tell, this is going to be just an awesome discussion just about the word energy transition and everything going on in the world today. What I'd like to start with is Armando. I want to start with you and how everything is going there in Brazil right now. You know, I know that you guys were basically energy independent, and now y'all are going through some different trials and tribulations yourself. But you know, what are you seeing out that way?
Brazil is in a very good shape in terms of energy. We are self-sufficient in terms of oil and gas. The production of Brazil is more than 3 million barrels a day, or 3% of the world, and the consumption is 2 and something. So we can export a little bit for different countries. For gas, is the same. We have 140 million cubic meters per day of production, and it's not enough for Brazil, but it's increasing very fast as we have a huge reserve in pre-salt and it's being explored by several companies, including Petrobras, the state-owned company. So we have a very comfortable situation. And for the electricity, 70% of our electricity comes from hydro. So it's a very clean situation in Brazil. So that's the reality. Very good. But Brazil is still a small country in terms of GDP. So we need to increase and distribute wealth for all people in the country. So it's good, and at the same time, it's a challenge for Brazil.
Well, I thank you for that. And, Irina, I want to ask you kind of the same question about Bulgaria real quick. What are you seeing over there in that region of the world that you're at right now with energy as far as how y'all are doing on receiving it and whatnot?
Right. Well, Bulgaria is the biggest exporter of electricity to the region, the wider region of the Balkans, because we produce quite a lot of electricity from a single nuclear plant. We've also got some big coal power plants. We don't use gas so much for, if at all, for electricity production, but we produce, like Brazil, more than we could use, so we export it, and that's quite good. As for self-sufficiency, however, while Brazil is completely self-sufficient in fossil fuels, we're only self-sufficient in coal. But that seems to be enough for now. I mean, it allows us to be an exporter disproportionate to our size. So I'd say we're better than much of Western Europe, ironic as this may be.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Western Europe there because I want to go to Tammy, who's in the United Kingdom. It's not England and it's not Wales. It's the United Kingdom. Is that correct, Tammy?
Yeah, that's correct, for sure. The situation here is interesting because there's a lot of potential in the North Sea, even though some fields have been declining. And there's great fights between the government and the environmentalists because the government wants to expand production and development and whatnot, and the environmental groups are suing the government for granting permissions. So I'm not sure what's going to happen in the North Sea to increase the production. And with respect to the electricity in the UK, it's a basket case. Their system was privatized a little while ago, and it's just a mess. And so 21 energy suppliers, electricity suppliers, went out of business during this terrible spike in prices. And so now there's fewer suppliers out there, and the government has provided subsidies and whatnot for the public, because otherwise it would be extraordinarily expensive to have electricity. And I'm not sure where that's going to end up in the next year. So it's an interesting time to be in the United Kingdom.
Let me ask you this real quick, Tammy, before we move on. Can you give me an example of how much maybe your electric bill has gone up in the last 12 months or so? Can you give an example of something like that?
It's tripled, and the government provides a little bit of support at least until the end of April. And after the end of April, the price cap that they've put forward will be gone. Now, depending on who your supplier was, your price might be a little bit different. So we were kind of fortunate that our house doesn't run on electric power. We have heating oil. So our electricity cost, even though it tripled, is mainly just for running the electrics in the house and not the heating.
Wow, that's pretty tense right there. That you're in a good position and it just only quote unquote tripled. I can't imagine that. David Blackmon, if you can just send Tammy a little bit of assistance for all those royalties that you get for all the shows that you do, David, that'd be real nice.
Well, it hadn't been as bad for us in the United States, that's for sure, as it has been in these other countries. I just interviewed earlier this morning Osama Rizvi, who I've contacted through LinkedIn, and he's in Pakistan, and their utilities have just exponentially gone up over the last year. And they have 45% inflation compared to our 6.5% inflation. So in the United States, whenever we start thinking we have it bad where energy costs are concerned, we need to just familiarize ourselves a little bit with what's happening in these other countries around the world. And the other thing, RT, that's going to happen in Texas soon is our electricity rates here in Texas are going to start falling because utility rates for your fuel charge on your utility bill always takes a few months to adjust to what's happening with natural gas prices. We get 40 to 50% of our electricity here in Texas from natural gas generation. And as everyone probably knows, the price of natural gas at Henry Hub has gone down by 70% since October. And right about now in March is when the utility rates for your fuel charge will start reflecting that. And so our bills are about to start going down in Texas, where most of the rest of the world, they're continuing to rise. And so we're incredibly fortunate to be where we are, and have a lot of sympathy for folks having to deal with what's happening in some of these other countries.
I don't, since this is an international panel, and I am thankful as well, and I hope a lot of our listeners also out there, good, bad, or indifferent, left or right, David, are very thankful and proud to be American. And that's, I'll leave that one at that today. I want to kind of talk about global climate change, climate activism. I know here in the United States, it is something that is just everywhere you look. There's protesting going on. Ban fossil fuels. We need to get wind and solar. And so from America, from where I sit, I see this all the time. Tammy, are you guys seeing that type of stuff there in the United Kingdom as well? And more importantly, do y'all see United States with all of our protests going on as well? And what do you think about that?
Well, in the UK, they're the ones who created Extinction Rebellion. I mean, Extinction Rebellion came out of the UK, and they're crazy where they throw, soup at paintings and they glue themselves to roads. And they have various offshoots, right? So now they have Animal Rebellion. So they've been gluing themselves to the roads to get people to stop eating meat. And they were going into supermarkets, taking milk out of the fridges and dumping it all over the floors to protest against people drinking milk. So the interesting thing in Canada, where I'm from, is that there was a study done a couple of years ago by the Alberta government about the various campaigns against the oil and gas industry. And it became quite clear that there's a lot of cooperation between American environmental groups, the UK environmental groups, the Canadian ones. So there's a lot of actually coordinated action that goes on between these groups in order to raise the profile of trying to keep oil and gas in the ground.
Wow. I did not know that was an extinction group like that with that title there in the United Kingdom. Armand, are y'all seeing the same type of protests there in Brazil at all for oil and gas?
No, Brazil is still, growing in terms of understanding of the energy problem. So it's totally different from Europe and the United States, I suppose. But Europe is worse. The problem in Europe is because it's more political than in reality the energy problem. In Brazil, we are very careful to the energy security, something that the government and Petrobras itself is taking care for a long of decades to not fault in terms of energy. That's our main focus. So these discussions of climate and alarmism is not something important in Brazil yet.
Now, my next question is, there in your different regions, are there really, like obviously in the United Kingdom, and with what you just talked about, our Armando, Irina, is there a big world effort for global warming to stop, quote unquote, global warming or this climate crisis that we're in? or is that something that we just see here in the United States more and the United Kingdom?
You mean the protest?
Yeah, the protests, the
The activists.
anti-oil, I mean, things like that. Yes.
I do think they are especially massive and especially loud in the English-speaking world and in Germany as well. That probably, to me, this has something to do with the wealth of a country, because what Armando just said, Brazil hasn't reached a point where climate change and alarmism around climate change matters to people, because there are lots of poor people in Brazil who have much more immediate, much more fundamental problems. It's the same in Bulgaria. We have a very tiny, loud minority of people who would protest everything that has to do with cutting down trees, for example, or exploring for shale oil, shale gas, or oil offshore. But there are very, very few of them. And that's because Bulgaria, too, is a poor country. It's one of the poorest members of the European Union. And people have bigger problems than climate change. It's the same across Eastern Europe as opposed to Western Europe. And those protesters, they don't really look like, people with money problems, if I may be so blunt. And we know that the latest kids on the block, Just Stop Oil, the people who are flinging soup on paintings. Yeah. It turns out they have billionaire donors. They have really strong financing. So these are people who are kind of professional career activists. It's a career now, apparently. So yeah, I think that's why there's this difference between the intensity of climate protest in Western Europe and the US, although I think there are fewer protests in the US, because I don't live there, I don't know about all of them, right. Than there are in, say, Brazil or Bulgaria.
Okay. David, Tammy and Irina bring up a great point each that, Tammy mentioned that there's coalition groups that are all kind of put together throughout the world. And then Irina mentioned, hey, they've got these billionaire backings. I was able to have an article on my Substack the other day talking about the gas stoves. And I know we briefly mentioned it on 3 Podcasters, but there's an anti-oil group out of Colorado that also has international backing and has other places where they promote anti-fossil fuels, and that place is China. And so why is it that China is so concerned about the oil and gas industry here in America?
Well, China wants to see the United States to lower its standards of living. China wants to see the United States population become poorer because it makes us more vulnerable. But just to comment too on some of the things the others said. And first, now you see why doing this international energy transition podcast is like my favorite hour of every week, because I learn so much and so many different perspectives from these 3 folks. When you talk about the animal extinction rebellion people, I can only wonder, why don't they glue their hands to wind turbines to protest the killings, the fact that the wind industry is the second biggest killer of birds on the planet, or to protest the 9 dead whales that have washed up on the shores of the Atlantic coast adjacent to these offshore wind projects all of a sudden. I don't understand why we're not seeing that happening. And the other thing to say about these groups is not that they're just more intense in the English-speaking world, but they're more intense among upper-class white English-speaking people of the world. When you look into the backgrounds of these protesters, they're almost uniformly from wealthy white families that have grown up in privileged households. And as Irina points out, they don't have enough real things in their lives to worry about. They don't have real problems to address to give them feelings of self-worth. And so they stage these ridiculous, ludicrous protests where they block traffic, where they damage priceless works of art, to get attention for themselves and to virtue signal, to make people think they're doing something that makes them worthy human beings. And this is a phenomenon in the Western world. And when you, as Armando says, Brazilians by and large don't have time to worry about stuff like this. When you're dealing with, high inflation and rising food costs, and just wondering where, how you're going to keep your family warm during the winter, worrying about whether or not you're getting your electricity from windmills or natural gas is just not really at the top of your list of priorities. And as you can tell, it makes me pretty angry to hear all this. And but that's reality. That's the truth. And it's a really sad aspect of Western society these days.
I would say that that's the crude truth, David, that it is sad in the Western society where we are at a point in the world that, here in the, especially, and I'll tie it into the oil and gas industry, we have an age gap from about 20 to 30 that we don't now have individuals out there working, excited about the opportunity to do a hard day's work, to earn a good dollar, because there is so much now going on to where these individuals are now being almost indoctrinated in college not to do anything, and that oil and gas is bad, and that the rest of the world, and that by us getting rid of oil and gas, the rest of the world, like the Bulgarias and the Brazils and the United Kingdoms, will benefit from the United States stopping their production of oil and gas, which just is not the case, which, again, you're absolutely right. That is one unique and great thing about the Energy Transition podcast, is that you guys do give that worldly view on a weekly basis about, hey, what's going on throughout the world. Because whenever you watch the news at night, they might do a 2-minute blurb on what's going on across the world. And then they don't really even talk about what really is going on. They just kind of give a quick little blip. And I mean, Irina, what you're doing over there and representing, Bulgaria in that area, there's so much that goes on over there on a daily basis that we don't even know about. And, Armando there in Brazil, we know that y'all have had some issues, I think, government-wise. But, hey, that was very unique that you guys were energy independent. And now look at you guys still are. And that's something that's awesome, that here in the United States, we still strive to do on a daily basis. But getting into, talking about the global aspect of things, the IEA just announced that we're going to need an increased amount of crude oil. So we've got an increased demand of crude moving into the rest of this year. Irina, what do you think about how the IEA is looking at this and how they're projecting this year?
Well, it makes me think about their roadmap to net zero, which I love to quote, as David and Armando very well know. When it's serious, David, don't laugh. In that roadmap, in this document, which they issued in 2021, they said we would not be needing new oil and gas exploration after December 2021. Since then, they have revised upwards their oil demand forecasts and their projections that we would actually need more oil and gas. Now, I would very much like to meet Mr. Fatih Birol someday, so I could ask him, how does this square, how does the roadmap to net zero square with these projections that the agency he had produces on a regular basis? Which report are we supposed to believe? Which report should we take seriously? The oil market report, which the IEA publishes every month, or this, the roadmap to net zero. And it's not just the roadmap. I mean, Bureau and the IEA have been repeatedly stating we need to give up fossil fuels. The latest example was at the Davos meeting of the World Economic Forum, where Mr. Bureau once again said that, yes, we need to phase out oil and gas. So how are we going to satisfy this higher oil and gas demand if we phase out production? It sounds like a ridiculous question, but apparently it's a question that needs to be asked in light of these conflicting signals coming from the same place.
You're absolutely right, Irina. Armando, do you want to add anything to that, what Irina just said?
Yes, fantastic analysis. As always, Irina is fantastic. But the problem is the following: they do not have a plan. So every day they are changing projections and forecastings. So it's complicated that way. And we need to learn how to live with all energies. So each energy has good things and bad parts. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
Of course, we have problems with oil and gas, but we have problems with all other energies, renewables, for instance, metal, minerals, and some different problems that we have with other. So the recommendation for Mr. Birol, friend of David, is to have more planning process than they have today. So to see the future in a line, not in a, let's see, conturbated road.
Tammy, the other day, I wrote a little post on LinkedIn that they do want to call this an energy transition and get us away from oil and gas and coal. But wouldn't it really, everybody also trying to be nice, saying, hey, we need an energy addition. Like we need to add more to the system. But, there in the UK and where you guys are at, y'all obviously have a high demand for oil and gas this year and going into already next year. And we're still here in the first quarter of 2023. Is that correct?
Yes, that's true. And if I could just contribute a little bit of something about the IEA, it's what we kind of talked about before, that it's a rather schizophrenic organization, because you have Fatty Birol talking about it's the end of the world and the end of oil and gas and coal. And then you've got the actual technical guys who produce these reports that say, hold on a second, there's still going to be demand. And what I found interesting about that recent statement was that they're projecting jet fuel is going to be one of the main reasons why there's going to be this increased demand for oil to make the jet fuel. And they were trying to say it's mostly from China. China's reopening, people are flying around more. And then I thought, well, maybe this is related to the jets that they're supposed to be giving to Ukraine, and they're expecting an increase in the fighting in Ukraine or something. They're going to need jet fuel. So it's interesting how the EU has declared natural gas as a bridge fuel at the same time that they're saying they need to get off natural gas and get off coal. And then it goes back to what David was talking about, Pakistan, where you have, poor Pakistan had natural gas. They were going to switch to natural gas and not build any more coal plants. And then they were priced out of the market because the EU's been buying it all up and paying premium dollar for it. So now Pakistan has to quadruple the amount of coal-fired power plants because they need something reliable. And they can't secure the natural gas because the EU's been driving up the price. So all these things, as you talk about trade-offs, there's trade-offs. And so we're seeing this imbalance in the global energy markets, not just because of climate change and what they're doing, but for these decisions that the Europeans are making in order to make sure that their people don't freeze and all the lights don't go off. But it has ripple effects around the world, and we're seeing that in Pakistan. And once China's economy starts going, and there's a whole lot there about the geopolitical situation with China and the United States and whatnot. But if China has an increase in demand, it's got to come from somewhere.
Yeah. You know, David, I know that you politely turned down the head of when they asked you to be the head of the IEA a couple months back.
I don't think that's in the cards. No.
Oh, that wasn't okay. Maybe I got my notes wrong. I'll have to go back and check. David, no, please tell everybody what IEA stands for, and if you want to kind of wrap up that IEA that everybody's been talking about here.
Well, it's the International Energy Agency, and it is an organization that was commissioned by a group of countries. I think initially it was about a dozen countries that formed it, 20, 30 years ago now. It's been a while. Now there's over, I think, 130 of the countries in the world subscribe to it and support its efforts, and including all of the countries in the Western world. And it, until Mr. Birol came along, it was a pretty widely respected and recognized authority on, producing reliable data about what's really happening in the energy world. It's been politicized a lot more in recent years, just like everything else has. And so you always have to be careful how you cite what they publish, and how you read the reports they put out, and how you try to decipher the statements Mr. Birol makes publicly. And that's a shame, because even in this Biden administration that has politicized everything in our climate today, the Energy Information Administration, the EIA, that's run out of the Department of Energy, has managed somehow to avoid being politicized. And I think that's a real credit to the people who run that administration over there. Because, Jennifer Granholm, the Secretary of Energy, is perhaps the most politicized animal who's ever held that job. Yeah. And incredibly biased and just nonsensical in some of the things she says. So everyone at the EIA should be proud that they've managed to maintain that objectivity and focus on real data and real science that has been somewhat lost at the IEA. And that's too bad. But, when you have this politicized entity like the IEA projecting not just record demand for crude oil this year, but demand for crude that's going to rise until the mid-2030s and then plateau all the way until after 2050 before it starts to fall. That is a mirror image of ExxonMobil's projection for crude oil demand over the next 30 years. Oh. And so when a politicized agency like that is making the same projection ExxonMobil is, that crude demand is strong today, and it's going to remain strong for decades to come. And we should be planning, the world's governments ought to be planning for that scenario in the future, instead of trying to live in this dream world where we've already supposedly reached peak oil and it's just going to fall dramatically in the next few years. That's not going to happen, and pretending it is going to happen is incredibly destructive to efforts to provide adequate energy to the developing nations of the world, not the Western world, the developed world, but the developing nations of the world need to plan realistically so that they are able to have adequate and affordable energy to grow their economies.
You're absolutely right, David. And this way of life to where that we are only going to continue to add demand for the next at least 10 years. So oil is only going to go up, that demand and the supply. We need more oil. So hopefully we can get our administration here in the United States to a place that will be more friendly. And yes, Jennifer Granholm, that lady, I don't know if she's the least qualified individual ever for a position, but she definitely is coming in at a close second if there's somebody better than her. And then, you talk about politicizing the IEA. As I'm sure you all are aware, that we have recently just started taking again a total of another 26 million barrels out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve here in the United States. And, everybody that knows me knows that I'm against it. Everybody knows that, hey, David's against it. From an outside the United States perspective, Irina, Tammy, and Armando, what do y'all see and what do y'all hear and see when y'all hear that the United States is taking important oil out of their Strategic Petroleum Reserve? Tammy, I'll start with you.
Okay, I'm going to be completely honest. No one in the UK cares.
Okay, thank you, Tammy. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
The same here in Brazil.
Right. I mean, it's a blurb on a headline. Oh, the U.S. is releasing more of their Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and people are like, yeah, okay, sure, whatever. I don't know. But it's like it's a secure, strategic petroleum reserve. It's meant to be used in emergencies. And since the 90s, it's been used now and then to pay off this debt, pay off that debt, or do all these other things. And it's not really serving the purpose that it needs to serve, unfortunately, especially when there's a war going on. And, something catastrophic could happen this year. Maybe they shouldn't be draining it to the extent they are.
And Armando, I saw you said that it's not a big deal there in Brazil as
no,
well.
It's the same.
Yeah.
Doesn't affect Brazil. Yeah. So it's something very particular to the country, and it's more for a war point of view than strategic point of view. Sometimes we see that are some misunderstandings in terms of what is the strategic, as Tammy said before. For us, it's indifferent.
And Irina, same for you over there in Bulgaria?
Well, honestly, I don't think anyone outside the United States cares about the SPR releases. But in all fairness, this release of the 26 million barrels was, I think, approved by Congress earlier. It's not part of those emergency, monstrous 180 million barrels release that took place last year. And yet, they could have probably canceled the sale. I don't know. I mean, they're actually trying to start replenishing the Strategic Petroleum Reserves, but prices refuse to fall to their target level. So I don't know how this is going. I think this is the bigger problem. They will have to start filling it again, but prices are not falling. So what are they going to do?
Yeah, the RT, the interesting thing about it is by statute, by the requirements of the laws that govern how that thing's used, I guess it's been almost 6 weeks now since they were required to start filling it by law, and they haven't done it, and they won't do it. And here's the reality in the United States, because the Justice Department isn't going to attempt to enforce the law on this administration. That reserve will only begin to be refilled when it's politically advantageous to Joe Biden and the Democratic Party to do so. And it won't matter what the price of oil is at that time. That won't matter. That never matters where this SPR is concerned. What will matter is whether or not it's politically advantageous to do it. And when it is, that's when it'll happen.
Oh, man. Thank you guys so much for that. That brought some reality definitely back. Because, again, we get and I don't want to say I know I get consumed being a small independent producer. That's my background, family owned and operated. So we drill oil wells and we do keep up with the legislation because we are a small company that sometimes we got that other bigger companies forget about us. And it's hard for us to keep up with a lot of the regulations because they do cost a lot more money to continue those. So we do try to stay we try to stay up to beat and up to date on what's going on. So sometimes I guess we do get a little bit more focused here in the United States But to hear from you guys that, hey, nobody cares about what's going on with the United States with the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And so I want to kind of follow that up with talking about global warming again, if that's okay. That, here in the United States, I think we have some of the best rivers and streams and lakes, and I know David's mentioned this before, that we've come such a long way with our recycling and getting our ecologies and our environment a lot cleaner. I remember the years of talking about the acid rain up in the Northeast when I was growing up here in Texas. You heard about the acid rain and all the smog all over. So here in the United States, we've done a lot of good things to combat environmental pollution. Do you see that going on, Irina, there in Bulgaria, to where you guys are also doing your part to help out with global warming and whatnot?
First of all, it's not global warming, it's climate change.
Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry.
Climate
Global
change.
warming
So we
was...
can,
Wait, hold
use
on. No,
it as
Irina.
an umbrella term for
Irina.
all sorts of weather we don't like.
If I may, real quick, hold on. Global warming was last year's keyword, hot topic word. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's climate change now. Yeah, not global warming. I'm sorry.
I think so. Yeah, now with all this, unnatural freezing weather in December in the Northern Hemisphere and all that. Well, I see a lot of things being blamed on climate change here as well. And of course, we have now codes for extreme weather, even if the extreme weather is a drizzle. We get cold yellow rain. That's an EU thing, actually. They have codified weather so we can get worried more easily, and believe that there is a reason to be alarmed about the weather. So yeah, there's some of that too, definitely in my part of the world. But I blame the European Union.
Okay, and now of course Brazil is just beautiful, so we don't got to worry about Brazil. Is that correct, Armando?
We have a lot of initiatives, very, very strong initiatives. The first one is ethanol. Ethanol, we have 25% in the gasoline, so it's a very strong portion in gasoline. For biodiesel, for instance, is 14 or 15% in the diesel, so it's a strong reduction of carbon emission. We have capture of carbon in the production side, so reinjecting reservoirs is a very strong initiative. So we are going a good way. But the point is that the climate discussion is much more than politics. It involves, let's see, understanding of the problem, the real problem. And we are not discussing the real problem, but discussing intentions, trends, interests, and different things. That's not exactly preservation of the world.
Thank you. And Tammy, what about you guys over there?
Well, to kind of bring it back to energy transition, and the way I think of it is that climate change is the rationale for revolution, and they're normally an energy transition is natural. There's a more efficient means of energy that's replacing or at least adding to existing forms of energy. But here we're regressive, and it's being forced by governments rather than what's actually better technologically or in an energy density terms. And so here you have a climate change movement, which has morphed, of course, from global cooling to global warming, and now the all-encompassing climate change. And it's come to the point where you can't even have a conversation about it. You have to pledge allegiance to the belief, and it has all of these other components to it that we see in the EU. Like Irina was talking about the color coding of weather. They do the same thing in the UK. So what used to be a nice balmy day, 20 degrees would be green. Now it's red, and it's 20 degrees, and you're saying it's red. And they do the same thing in Canada, where when it's cold, they've added wind chill to the temperature. So then it's like super blue, and everyone says, oh no, it's colder than ever, but it's warmer than ever. And there's this inconsistency, but it feeds into that whole idea that there's something always changing. We should always be worried, always concerned. In order to facilitate this transition, that is going to change our way of life, our standard of living, and isn't necessarily for the better. If it will bring us down to the same kind of living standard as those people in the developing world. And I hate to say it, but there's a lot of academic articles that make that case. And these are the same academics who are supporting the energy transition the way it is. So when you have, like, the environmental groups have captured a lot of the politicians in Western Europe, in Canada, and to some extent now in the Biden administration, the American government. So um, the way that the whole climate change movement has done this, from using the activists to train people, then to capture governments, is putting us on this trajectory that I don't think will be beneficial for the future of our civilization.
Boom, right there. That's the crude truth. Tammy, you brought that all back. Thank you so much. Irina, Armando, David, we're coming up here to the end. The Energy Transition Podcast, y'all do that on a weekly basis. Irina, how can people find you?
Well, they can find me on Twitter, Slav Energy. I think there was a line between Slav and Energy. It doesn't really matter. I also do a Substack newsletter, Irina Slav on Energy, and of course I write about oil and gas and the transition for oilprice.com.
And Armando, how can people get a hold of you and find you out on the internet?
Oh, he's muted.
Armando, you're muted.
Armando, you're muted.
Sorry. It's very easy. It's through the website cavanha.com. Cavanha is my surname, so it's very easy. Cavanha.com.
Hold on. Let's and Armando, let's try that one more time. And Armando, where can people find you at?
Pardon?
Where can people find you and get a hold of you?
Yes, exactly. Via the website cavanha.com, but maybe via Twitter @Cavanha.
Okay. And Tammy, where can people find you and get a hold of you?
I have a website called thenemethreport.com, and I also do a podcast called The Nemeth Report, where I interview people about the energy transition and net zero and ESG and all these different kinds of things. And I'm also on LinkedIn under T. Nemeth.
Awesome. And Mr. Blackmon, a.k.a. David, the Forbes contributing author, where can people find you, sir?
I don't know. After what I've said on this podcast, they might find me in jail pretty soon. I'm on Twitter. My handle on Twitter is @EnergyAbsurdity. I have my own Substack, blackmon.substack.com. I contribute at Forbes.com. I've written there for a decade now, and recently began contributing as well at the Daily Caller online. And I do podcasting and with you, Ray, and all of y'all, and then I have my other podcast, which is The Energy Question, and so all I do is talk and write, folks. That's all I do. That's my life.
Well, David, again, I want to say thank you very much for getting this international panel together today. And guys, thank y'all so much for either staying up late or waking up ridiculously early for being here today with us here in the great state of Texas. So thank you all very, very much. And we'll see you next time here on The Crude Truth.
This episode of The Crude Truth is brought to you by Oil and Gas Workers Association, Sandstone Group, Air Compressor Solutions, Basin Fluids and the Fuel Pros, and Real News Communication Network.
The easiest way to start your own podcast and TV show? Real News Communications Network. Stand out from your competition. Produce streams of high-quality social media content. Become a thought leader in your industry. With RNCN, you get to be the host. We handle everything else. Tour one of our 3 locations in Dallas, Fort Worth, and the Colony. Call 972-402-6333 or visit launchashow.com to find out more.